Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to the Rabbit Holes That Quack, episode number 3. You're mostly related to today's documentary, Sasquatch podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the woman, the myth, a quack of urban legend, Miss Nicole Matthews.
Hello, listeners.
And if you are just joining us well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Nicole and I subject ourselves to a random documentary every week and let that be the springboard for a larger conversation about the issues therein. If you'd like to drop a particular documentary into the hat for us to choose from, we'll be choosing them from amongst our patrons at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack, where you can also submit broader topics, comments, and questions for both this and our other sister podcast, such as The Movies That Quack, where co-host Wade Slicken and I put each other on the spot each week to ask each other Hollywood's most poignant and stupid questions about what we think will happen next, as well as The Conversations That Quack, where co-host Efren Garcia and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues facing the Black movie protagonist. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of any one of our tiers that start as low as $1, which includes early access to all of Pandora's Quack's podcast. But if that's not in the cards for you right now, that's more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. And so, listeners, without further ado, these are the rabbit holes that quack. Tonight's documentary is called Sasquatch. As you heard me mispronounce earlier, it follows the investigative journalist David Holthouse as he attempts to solve a bizarre 25-year-old triple homicide that was said to be the work of the mythical creature. It was directed by Joshua Rofe, who is known for other documentaries such as Kupinda, Kids Behind Bars, Life or Parole, and Active Shooter, America Under Fire. And as of this recording, Sasquatch currently sits at a 91% critical Rotten Tomatoes rating with a 59% audience score. So, Nicole, much like last time, and as teased at the end of last week's episode, I'll let you decide if you want to kind of pull in a little bit from the documentary, or if you want to just sort of take a second, think about your answer. But do you believe in Bigfoot?
I mean, I think I stick by what I said last time, is that, like, I want to believe that something like that could exist. But, like, no, I don't actually believe that it does. But I think the lore of it is enticing.
Yeah, I would say I'm probably in the same boat, because I would like to compare it all to, like, the ghost hunter shows that have been out there for the last couple decades, and how with all the technology we have today, especially being able to sort of just whip out a phone at a moment's notice, we have nothing definitive for ghost. And I think with drones and all that kind of stuff, it just seems like we would have caught something by now. Although, if folks have been following the less than subtle government UFO disclosures, we probably are more likely to see aliens than ghost at this point. I think my favorite thing this past week was an interview with Obama, and I think he said he asked if there were aliens, and it just seemed like he got like a giant shrug from the government, which I thought was quite amusing. What were your expectations heading into this? I'm sure when I was like, hey, watch Sasquatch, you probably were like, why? Why are we doing this? What is going on here? Yeah, what were your expectations for a documentary called Sasquatch?
I mean, yeah, I don't think I really had any, because that was all I knew was the title. I purposely didn't look to see what this was going to be about, other than the fact that I think it was going to be 3 different parts. But yeah, I think I expected it to have something to do with the lore of Sasquatch for sure. And I think I was also just sort of like pleasantly surprised to see what the documentary actually ended up being about. And also just being from California, it was just kind of really cool to see this examination of this very particular area in the state.
Yeah, it was, I had Ancient Aliens on the mind, with a true crime twist kind of sprinkled in. This ended up on my radar because of I saw a clip on your favorite show, the Joe Rogan Show, where David basically summed up the premise of just there was a triple homicide that looked like it was executed by Bigfoot, and sort of my ears obviously perked up about how fascinating that just idea sounds. And so naturally, when you have two ideas, one Sasquatch and then one just being a triple homicide that's sort of been unsolved for 20 years, those could be documentaries unto themselves, but seeing that they somehow were aligned seemed pretty interesting. So figured we would dive in. And so with that, what did you actually think about the documentary, just as a film? I've been asking this the last couple of weeks. I don't know if it necessarily applies here, but did it seem fair? Did it seem biased, this documentary based on Sasquatch?
Yeah, first of all, I guess up front, I really, really enjoyed this documentary for a number of different reasons. I think because, one, I didn't know going into it what exactly it was going to be about. So I think it was kind of a pleasant surprise that it was essentially kind of a true crime series, which I love. And I think that for me, to your point about was it biased, I actually do think it was a very well-rounded documentary in the sense of it did try and kind of, I think, explore all different sides of essentially, this murder that he was investigating. And I think, in sort of diving into that, obviously having to, give us a peek into this area, into the people that lived there, into the dynamics that would even create a murder like this in the first place, right? And I do actually think he did a good job of sort of showing, again, where different people might be coming from, their motivations for living in an area like that in the first place and working there, or maybe how they came to be there. And I found it fascinating the way it unfolded. And I think in particular, the way, I don't want to give too much away, but the way in which you kind of are led down this path to believe that, potentially could it be this mythical, creature that we've heard about for years. And then, what ultimately kind of unfolded as being the truth. I thought there was a really cool, link through with that, that was kind of surprising in the end, but also made the most logical sense also.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn on the documentary, and I think more on the format of the documentary, because I definitely felt a little bored during that first episode. And this may have been sort of because I had sort of the inverse of you, where you kind of were like, oh, I guess we're going to watch this documentary about this docu-series about Bigfoot. And then it kind of starts to kind of dive into something a little bit more crazy. And I think I was kind of sitting there, just kind of letting the setup kind of happen and just sort of the exploration of sort of the urban legend and that kind of stuff. And it felt like it was taking a really long time to actually sort of get to anything. And it sort of made me start to question if this needed to be a series versus just an actual, hour and a half, 2 hour length sort of documentary. And I think it was because sort of the focus felt a little off. Most of the time when you're watching just a traditional true crime documentary, it's is this person guilty, or these are kind of the breadcrumbs, this is what we think of the case, that kind of thing. Serial kind of being the sort of, I guess, gold standard more for podcasting than for just visual documentaries. I'm blanking on the Making a Murder is the thing I was thinking of, where there's kind of just this central question that all the episodes sort of revolve around. And I can't tell if that's because really what we're watching is David be an investigative reporter. And so in doing that, you are going to naturally run into a lot of dead ends. You're kind of asking questions and sort of piecing things together and sort of talking out loud and sort of building this puzzle. But while he was sort of doing that, we're also sort of being treated to, this community and all the sort of history and all that kind of stuff. And all of those things I thought were interesting kind of unto themselves, the Emerald Triangle and sort of just what was going on with, sort of the weed rush and being compared to sort of the gold rush and all of that. But there's something that felt like the focus wasn't really there. And I know by maybe by episode 2, I was kind of man, are we ever going to actually get to this crime that's kind of alluded to? And so I sort of was just teetering on oh, that's interesting information. But what is this added layer of context have to do with anything?
I don't know, but I feel like you get to see pretty early on kind of like what he witnessed. So I think for me, after that point in the first part, I was invested in going on this journey with him of like, okay, he heard this thing. Now he kind of has to, I mean, to your point, yeah, like we were watching him as an investigative journalist backtrack from this moment, and kind of everything that took. And I think for me, I think the way he unpacked it was helpful, I guess. But yeah, maybe just a different take.
Yeah, it was definitely, this is kind of like what I tell you about like horror movies sometimes, where I'm like, as scary as like extremely well-made horror movie will make me forget about the production process. And I'm just kind of like, oh wow, I'm just like really taken aback by the work, if you will, of like these thousands of people that sort of put this together. And so like in watching this, it was like the animated sort of piece. I thought that was like really cool, kind of really well done. And I definitely like appreciated the digging into that, what happened that night, and just sort of like everything that was kind of going on with that. And then even to the extent I actually really enjoyed the sort of danger-ish, if you will, but I kind of like, and this is kind of, again, like when you just kind of watching a ton of movies and then just kind of knowing a lot about like production, I was kind of like, well, obviously he doesn't get, or at least the presumption was that, nothing severe happens to him enough to not want to kind of make this documentary. And I won't kind of spoil how he sort of addresses some of that sort of towards the end. But it was kind of cool to kind of have these, it almost was like reminding me of Fargo a little bit to a certain degree, because as dangerous as these people were, he was sort of able to get information or to have like intermediaries or like people sort of like convey information to him. And I was just like, this is such a weird, like, not like community, but just like a really intriguing insight into California. And this is probably something that like you being from there have more insight into, but obviously when people think of California, they basically think of like LA, or they think of like the North, San Francisco, or sort of like maybe like, sort of like the forest, and as more of like a vacation-y whatever kind of thing. But like I never put two and two together. This is like faux gold rush of what was going out there. And just kind of like the, I guess, quote unquote, war on drugs that was sort of spilling out into that region, I guess in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like blanking on some of their names right now, but there's a number of like series on Netflix, I think, that sort of explore kind of just like what's been going on in that area. I think both from a historical perspective, but then there's also like some more modern stuff of like them actually going and still like tracking down farmers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that kind of to me is what it was that I enjoyed. It was like peeling back the curtain a little bit on this like community, this area that maybe like most people would not be familiar with. And I think, he got lucky in a lot of ways. Obviously, this was the journey he was going on. But in terms of like documentary filmmaking, I actually was kind of shocked how many little like nuggets he just discovered along the way that were still sort of in a way related to this murder, but in the end, not really. Like he had this kind of benefit of, to your point, like just meeting with all these different sort of shady and interesting characters, and some of the like car meetups and stuff like that. Like, I just thought that was really kind of cool in a way that he was able to have kind of this journey of getting to this final solution that was so kind of colorful. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of crazy to think about. Most people probably don't know that history, I think, of like weed farming in California. And like they did spend a good amount of time kind of explaining that. And, it does kind of, I think, make you look at it in a different light, right? Just talking about the fact that it was a lot of like families that were really just kind of there, like trying to make money, right? And now sort of what it's become. And I think even like there's a lot of other scripted shows that sometimes like showcase this type of stuff, but just like where the industry is at now, right? Where it is like extremely dangerous. I've seen that in a lot of television shows where they're like guys with guns and they're driving up into the mountains. And like, for me, that wasn't just like a completely foreign thing. But it's crazy. It's crazy to think about that there's like a part of the country, especially in California, where people are living like this and having to protect their land. And it's kind of like a life or death situation.
Yeah, when he said something to the effect of, when he mentioned to people, during the course of his investigation, that people had died, he was sort of taken aback that the response that he got most often was that, which people, which is kind of weird because I know I've had a couple friends who have gone, I don't remember if it was California specifically, but had done that as their summer job, 1 year, where they just kind of went out and kind of did it. And they were just yeah, things were kind of intense, or they were crazy, or they were chill, or blah, blah, blah. And it was just a very, no one was asking questions. You just kind of keep your head down and whatever. And he was it was great money, but it's obviously stuff going on kind of thing. And so that aspect was pretty interesting. And then even, it's funny because it almost sounds made up when they're oh yeah, the Hells Angels are just kind of up there, just doing stuff. And you're just I haven't heard about the Hells Angels in a really long time. I'd almost forgotten that they were sort of a thing. Because there's, the stuff that was kind of happening in New York that you sort of forget about. I feel it's almost through a lens of tourism more so than a club kind of thing. But it was just that layered aspect of it. And then the stuff that the racism that was going on with the Hispanic community, that kind of surprised me because it was sort of one of those things where and again, you have far more insight into the local level California than I do. But I always thought it was a little bit more harmonious, I guess, because of just the way that the culture has sort of bled into just sort of the cuisine scene and some of that stuff. But maybe that's just, I don't even know. I guess that's more of a LA or probably even just a Southern kind of border town type mentality versus when you do go that far north. And it was kind of explained, from the non-Mexican point of view, why that was in the movie, which I thought was kind of interesting. But yeah, I just wasn't kind of, I guess, prepared for those two aspects in particular, as just being one more sort of layer to the onion here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think California is very geographically diverse. I think to your point, a lot of people, when they think of California, they do just think of LA. I grew up in Northern California in the Bay Area. And I think to your point, if you think about the Bay Area and just, Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, a lot of the kind of cities that have developed, they are very, very diverse. The town that I grew up in was extremely diverse. And I think that is something you also see, again, in LA. But there are these pockets in California that are still just historically very white, right? And I think certain communities up in the mountains are this way. I think there's areas in Sacramento that can be this way. It is still kind of, prevalent in different parts of the state. It's still a very, very big landmass, right? Third largest economy in the world. So I do think that part to me wasn't entirely shocking, kind of just knowing what I know about some of the mountain communities. But, it's also interesting the fact that, that is something that's desirable for immigrants to go do. They also see that opportunity and how lucrative it can be, right? And they're kind of willing to go in with everyone else and risking their life. And so I just thought the business side of it was really interesting as well. And also, just they touched on, again, even after legalization, some of these issues have persisted. And I think that's really fascinating too, because I think there's been a lot of positives for a lot of states that have legalized in terms of just money they've been able to see and how they've been able to use those funds. But I think, California was definitely one of the first. And it is really interesting just to think about the fact that the black market is still so prevalent, given that it was one of the first states really to legalize. So I think that's interesting. And it makes me wonder, for how long will that go on as we do continue to see other states legalize? Because I would love to know, is most of that black market weed going to places in California, or is it coming here to New York where you still can't get it here legally? So that part I thought was just kind of interesting to know, that still persists, even though the law, allows for it.
Yeah, it was interesting the way, I forgot what the guy's name was, but sort of the older guy, who was oh yeah, I can probably just put a call in to the guy who you think is the alleged killer. But just like him being like, yeah, as things have become more, I guess, legalized, how the violence has sort of just gone up exponentially. And it's like, it's one of those things where like one of the things that I will definitely take away from this movie that I really appreciate is like most of the time there's this very, very like sanitized pro weed, just like narrative that kind of comes out and everyone's like, oh, it's good, it's blah, 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 such and such. And it's just like everyone sort of beats the drum on it. And there's never really kind of a conversation or a story around sort of the bigger picture or sort of that pipeline, the way that even like chocolate, I think, has kind of been acknowledged, if not so much in the mainstream. But it's just kind of known that like there are places where chocolate comes from, where there's like sort of child labor or slave labor, or just like the conditions, there's just like inhumane and things of that nature. And so I think there was even, I forgot how long ago it was, where like you did have these companies like Hershey and such trying to basically be like, hey, we're going to take a look at this, we're going to investigate this and make sure that, you know, our products, the things that we're bringing to you are sort of above board. But I did think it was pretty interesting how he was just kind of like, yeah, the violence is sort of coming up because now you do have these people who I guess legally have a right to be there, and now they're going to sort of be coming to, you know, just butting heads with people who have been there since, you know, the 60s or 70s that have kind of been doing their thing and just sort of not really rocking the boat or kind of not really being touched. And I guess that will be sort of a very interesting thing to kind of watch, because to date, you know, that's kind of been a, you know, almost like an archetypical, oh, the cartel does it and they kind of run it up the border kind of thing for all sorts of drugs and such. But this being something that is, you know, within our borders, and kind of watching the camp thing, the campaign against marijuana planting, and just kind of how that was almost sort of like the first domino of just like, hey, here's the government, here's the official quote unquote authority coming to sort of create a situation that you can't have this. And I think even one of the camp people, kind of members, was like, yeah, it was just kind of fun. And then once they started kind of having booby traps and all this kind of stuff, then it just kind of, again, as that guy said, just the violence around it just sort of escalated. And as I said, I just appreciated how the movie was like, yeah, I mean, like, yes, for the most part, people were like peaceful when they kind of came up there, but like this is also a side of that same industry that is just kind of needs to get out there.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it is kind of insane to imagine that as a job, you know. I mean, it not just the ones where like you're constantly watching, but I'm blanking now on what the specific area was that he was looking at was called. But in that area where you're like way up into the mountains all the time, right? And you're just sleeping there. Like it does take a certain kind of person, I think, to be able to do that and to like want to do that. Because you do have to tend to the plant like all day long. And I just find that like fascinating as well, that like that's something that, you know, people are out there doing on a consistent basis. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think he was saying like once camp started, you know, people were kind of like, all right, like we've made enough money. And then it's just kind of like, obviously that's, you know, almost no different than, you know, obviously the scale of sort of potential violence and being overrun, but just like people who had like farms in their families for like generations, and then just kind of like being pushed out by these like larger, you know, giant corporations that can try to just kind of come in and either kind of starve you out or buy you out or just do sort of all these things. And it must be interesting to have all these people who've been there for decades that are just kind of like, yeah, this is what we're doing. And kind of to your point, I think they were saying people were like guarding it with, that one woman had mentioned that she just kind of patrols with like rifles, and just again like the scale of the booby traps with like bear traps, and just like, yeah, they used to just hang fishing line with like hooks at eye level and like all this stuff. The amount of people and like injuries and stuff must be insane out there, in addition to all of the I think when they interviewed that police officer, he was just like, yeah, there's just unsolved murders, and he just kind of like, he just says it matter of fact that he's like, the community, no one really wants to rat on each other, and that's just kind of how it is, and they try to solve as many as they can, but it's almost like he's like not optimistic. People just disappear.
Well, and I think like, you know, not just unsolved, but like the fact that they all generally accepted that there were just bodies up in the mountains too, yeah. Right? Like there's the difference between unsolved and like just not even ever brought in, which is insane to me. So that kind of creeped me out just to think about that, that was kind of, again, the state of things. And it, yeah, I don't know. I was definitely like for me, there was a lot of things about this that I didn't find surprising, and then certain things that were surprising just given again that like we have seen legalization in California for a while. And I think long term, like I would love for him almost to go and revisit some of this, but I wonder where will some of these characters in this documentary be like 10, 20 years from now? And it was even just interesting the people that talked about like getting out of the game as well, right? So I don't know. Like, I would definitely recommend this. I thought it was super fascinating just in terms of like something different from a true crime perspective. And I think that was the other thing, like as someone that does watch a lot of, true crime series, you don't always kind of get to see, I think, these like interviews. And again, like some of the car scenes I thought were really impactful. So for me, it was kind of exciting. You felt like you were more like in it real time as opposed to kind of hearing about it after the fact, which I would say is more what I see in a lot of true crime series.
Well, of course, you have to have someone named Bigfoot Gary, and you have to spend some time trying to track down Bigfoot Gary. The rumor side of the mountain was pretty interesting, and how everyone was just sort of like, oh, I heard that he probably had something to do with it because, of his daughter and such. And then I can't remember exactly how the connection ended up happening. I guess I can't remember if he said like he called the wife of Bigfoot Gary, or if she kind of contacted him, but just her being like, yeah, he's not a killer and he didn't have a daughter during this time, during this alleged thing. And it's just like it's funny because it's like, when you think about modern day, like urban living, like city living, and just kind of like rumors and people posting stuff online and all the stuff I'm watching in the background, Chrissy Teigen being canceled. But just like all these sort of like things that just can like happen just all of a sudden and then it's trending or whatever, but just like this information that gets like legitimately passed down the way it used to, like the old school way of just like the game of telephone of like, I tell you something and then you distort it a little and then the next person, the next person, the next person. And then this like urban legend of Bigfoot Gary as being this like ominous crime boss that lives in the mountains that no one can touch him. And then he did business with the quote unquote alleged killer sort of thing. It's just like that aspect was that was pretty fascinating from an investigative sort of standpoint. And I don't know, I guess, and they kind of give, sort of David's backstory about kind of like why he's able to do this. He's kind of, gives his explanation about like why he's drawn to stuff like this and how people seem to just shady characters seem to trust him. But just all of that was interesting. Just kind of watch how these like stories just percolated throughout the mountain and everyone just kind of assumed they were true. And it was only when David was kind of like attempting to connect dots that we were getting these weird stories that had nothing to do with those original 3 murders or stuff that was even more, I guess, sinister that was like happening either in the years right after or the years right before.
Yeah, my God. I mean, the story that the woman told him about her son witnessing a murder was insane to me. I think that that to me really highlighted just how prevalent some of this activity actually is, that something similar could happen and that he would kind of go down this rabbit hole that would end in him realizing it was a completely different crime. But I know what you mean just in terms of like him describing why this happens to him. And I also did think that was really fascinating because you can kind of look at him even in the beginning when he's like telling the initial story and see why things like this do happen to him, right? And I can kind of envision in a lot of different scenarios how he might play in terms of like these different communities he's been able to infiltrate. But I did think that was fascinating because he has this look about him. It's hard to describe where I understand why people would trust him.
Yeah, I mean, even to the extent when he was like had the hidden camera and was just sort of like up in the mountains and just talking to that guy, and the guy was like, yeah, there are just some people that they're no longer around, they shouldn't have been doing what we're trying to do. And then just them kind of nonchalantly being like, yeah, just don't put my face on camera, but it's cool that you're up here, and I'm probably passively admitting to sort of being involved in deaths. I was expecting that to be on camera more. I guess it's probably just more implied that I'm sure the rumor mill had been like, oh, there's this guy who's making a documentary. Because I would imagine if you're up there being like, hey, I'm curious about these 3 specific murders, it just seems like violence or like someone would have tried to scare him or like something of that nature. But I guess it's one of those things that like if you lived in this environment in the way that that police officer was just like, yeah, I mean, like we just don't have enough evidence and no one's telling us kind of like what to do. And like to your point, like we're just, we just kind of assume the bodies are out there and there's really, unless someone points us to the body, like in the case of the Hispanic woman's, I forgot what it was. It was her father, grandfather, uncle, or something like that.
I think her uncle.
Yeah. That unless someone just specifically is like, oh, this is where that you can find the body. I think everyone just kind of is like, yeah, I mean, unless you basically literally catch me standing over the body holding the murder weapon, it's like the wild, wild west kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think my take on him being safe is just that probably, as they kind of highlighted, a lot of the people that end up getting murdered are people that either don't have people coming looking for them or people that if they come looking for them aren't really going to have the power to do much, right? Like it is this kind of like neglected community in that sense, right? So I feel like he's almost protected in this sense by being an outsider, I guess, if that makes sense, where it's like none of them really are going to do anything criminal because someone would probably come looking that would be like an issue for them, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think his outsider status might have protected him just a little bit in that sense. But I don't know. Maybe it's also just to his point, the fact that people think he already kind of looks like a criminal, because people did open up to him very, very quickly in a lot of those instances.
Yeah, and I don't think he was really even trying to like, I guess maybe even the way, and at this point, as he kind of outlines that he had kind of been embedded with a couple different groups. There's like a white supremacy group and I think another one that like, I guess he knows how to phrase a question to where it's like, I'm just genuinely curious. Like, I don't really care who did it. I'm just like, hey, can you like tell me how this happens kind of thing? Because even, and then, just not spoiling it, but it's like, even when we do essentially find out what happens, it feels like, I'm sure he talked to that guy at some point already, or should have talked to that guy already. And I was kind of like, oh, obviously that guy wasn't going to volunteer information, but it just seems like that would have been sort of the place where he would have started, since that's kind of how all of this sort of got kicked off to begin with.
Yeah, I definitely think that part was like murky to me. I wasn't sure if he just had put kind of a feeler out and that guy just happened to kind of get back at that time. I don't know. That part to me wasn't as clear in the documentary.
I do have to say that was incredibly smart, though. Even though 3 people got murdered, that just seems like one of the most. If ever they were going to be a quote unquote 4D chess move for how do you make people afraid of the consequences of just crossing any of these people kind of up in this country, that just seems like a very smart way to do it.
I mean, it's also just, again, a very clever way to perpetuate these lores that we have, right? I think that to me was kind of, I don't know, I guess going back to some of your original comments, that's part of why I disagree. I think the setup was kind of fascinating in that we needed to understand why it was such a prevalent concept, that these men could have preyed upon in the first place, right? Like, all of that kind of had to have a runway. And I think that they definitely spent a lot of time kind of, going through that with like the film, which was kind of fascinating to see again. Like, I can't remember the last time I've seen the Sasquatch film. So that was super interesting. But, I think that sort of build up is kind of what helps land the ending in a lot of ways. But yeah. It just, again, it was very strange for me going in blind, realizing that these 2 things were going to be linked together in such a way. But it does help to kind of continue Bigfoot on.
Yeah, the guy who I guess like wore that costume in sort of the infamous video. It was kind of interesting to kind of just hear him talk about it. But it is one of those things where, again, like during that era, I guess everything was just easy to fake. I mean, like even this one stand-up comedian, I remember him talking about how back in the days people could like go and rob banks, and then like literally as they kind of were escaping, they could like take the Tommy gun and like spell their name in the wall and then just like walk away, and they still would go free for a decade after, kind of thing. Unlike now where, you know, there's like so many ways that you can sort of track someone down, I guess. But yeah, just that infamous video with like the turn and everything just sort of like cracks me up. But I don't know if there's been, I guess maybe that's like the root one, or like the most iconic one. I feel like there's been a lot, but I guess that's like the point, is that there are just a lot of hoaxes and a lot of kind of strange photos that just kind of picked up on that.
I must say, I think another aspect of this for me, especially with just some of like the background building into like those communities and things like that, is like just that it is such an attractive concept to think about just going and living off the grid like that sometimes. I don't think I would last very long, truthfully, but I kind of found myself daydreaming about that and in hearing about the families and how they'd like settled there. And I think that's also kind of a function too of like, again, growing up in California and driving through some of those mountains. And it's beautiful, right? Like you are just surrounded by these gigantic trees. And it's just sort of a mystical feeling in a lot of ways. And so I definitely thought that part was cool, because I think a lot of people are kind of, you know, especially just given the fact that we've been in a global pandemic. I think this documentary was kind of well timed from that perspective as well. You know, a lot of people, I think, are probably thinking about that, about going and living in places that are a little bit quieter or, you know, even off the grid, which is another great show that I'm really enjoying, about people that actually go and live off the grid in different places in America. One of the dudes is actually living in caves, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I guess we'll see how many, not even so much documentaries, but just how many stories get told about the last year. Because like to your point about being off grid, there's probably people who were, you know, living off of farms and all that kind of stuff that like when they were locked down, they were more or less able to self-sustain, unlike some of the folks who, you know, made sort of makeshift gardens and all that kind of stuff. But just I imagine if you were already on a farm of some sort, there might have been sort of a certain level of sustainability. And I think there was even like that Amish, I think it was the Amish, where, because I remember during the Black Lives Matter stuff, they were like they saw like the Amish on like their horse and carriage, I think, were like also like doing something. I can see the image in my head, and I just don't remember exactly what the context was, but yes. If there's anything else that seemed strange. Have you ever been up to, I guess, to see the redwoods and all that kind of stuff, that area where they were talking about?
I've seen redwoods in California, but not in the exact area they're talking about for all of the reasons they talked about in the documentary.
Yeah.
You don't go up there. You don't go up there unless you like know who you're going up there to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, it's one of those things where like when you just think about the lore, that it's like I was saying, you would imagine that something would have been caught on camera one way or another at this point. But I think even the Loch Ness Monster, I feel like they keep seeing something every now and then that gets like semi-verified as like being like not a hoax or true or something like that. Like it's like 51% like probably an actual thing. Because I feel like I remember seeing something where they were comparing the original image to something that had been taken, I think, within the last like 10 years or something like that. And somebody was on the lake recently.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, I feel like because there aren't like, you know, at least to my knowledge, there are not like huge establishments in that area to go like stay and stuff like that. So that kind of safety risk is very real. So I think like that's the main reason. But to your point, like the Bigfoot lore is kind of a prevalent thing. I think if you're like growing up in California and you're kind of like driving through some of those communities sometimes, like even like I grew up like going in to Santa Cruz, and you would still hear about it there. So I think stuff like that is really funny. And California has a few examples of that type of thing, where just like weird kind of attractions or stuff like that. So to me, it's all very in line with sort of the free spirit side, I guess, of the state, which you do definitely find in a lot of like the coastal communities.
Yeah. Last thing I have here is when, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier, when David is talking about Final Cut, and he kind of talks about, there's Final Cut for legal reasons and sort of for safety reasons. There was a couple folks in the documentary that were kind of like, hey, I think I'm knocking on the doors of something that is incredibly dangerous. I need to sort of step away kind of thing. And then they just sort of warn him to be like, hey, tread carefully sort of thing. It's an interesting idea. And again, kind of like, I'm glad that they put that into the documentary because it sort of alleviates some of the questions that, we were talking about much earlier about just sort of like, it seemed like he was willingly putting himself sort of in danger. And even to the point where they sort of bleep out him saying the name of sort of the alleged killer. They never say it. And then of course, they'll always have people that are, they won't show their faces or there's kind of blurred out and stuff. But I just thought that was really fascinating that it was like, I'd never seen that before where they just like, every time he spoke it was just like alleged killer. Which is, it's an interesting thing, as I was saying, just to kind of have in a documentary. It's like one of those things where it's like, why? It's like it's just an interesting choice because you could very well just like bleep it out and then it's like, oh, okay, shrug. But then I guess it's kind of like, that's your, call it dramatic license to be like, oh, he's speaking the name of like the person who like allegedly did it kind of thing. I don't know if you had thoughts about that, but I just thought that was like an interesting choice overall to kind of do it that way.
No, I think to your point, that's probably the thing probably one of the very few things that I disliked about the documentary, mostly because I found the sound extremely annoying to listen to. So I think the first time I heard it, I was kind of like, oh, okay, like that doesn't feel great on my ears. And then it kept happening and I was like, oh, we're going to keep using it. So for me, I think it was just more obnoxious than anything. Yeah. And that was why it stood out to me. I found the sound really, really irritating.
Nice. Yeah, it's I feel like that was probably one of those things where like, in whatever version he had, it was fine. And then eventually the lawyers were like, yeah, you probably can't do that. And even one of the people he was speaking to was like, hey, I live here. So I can't like keep asking these questions, but like be careful even with you having sort of your outsider status. So very cool. Any final thoughts about the Emerald Triangle, that lovely Spyglass Road, Hell's Angels, Bigfoot Gary?
Yeah, I think just like as I said earlier, like for me, as someone who really likes true crime documentaries, I think that this one will just continue to stand out as something a little bit different and unique. I mean, that's probably because so many of them right now follow, serial killers, or just, again, sort of like really kind of like dark, deep stuff. Not to say this wasn't, but this to me, I think just had sort of like a very different edge and kind of spin to it. And even just given the certain area that it was focused on, just different than I think a lot of true crime documentaries I've seen recently. So I think if you're someone that enjoys those, you should definitely check this out, just because it'll give you kind of a new flavor of what's possible in this category. I think even as you mentioned too, like the animations, I thought that was really cool, the way that was weaved into it. So yeah, I think it's just, it's definitely something that shows that, true crime can be approached in a different way.
Yeah, I would give it a soft recommendation because I do think those final 15, 20 minutes, definitely your eyes kind of just like widen, the jaw kind of opens. But I think the journey to getting there could be formatted differently. It's kind of like we were saying before. I appreciated all of the information we got. I just don't know. unlike kind of what you were saying about like when you're diving into like a serial killer or something like that, you're kind of, it's very clear what sort of the thesis is, where it's just like, you know, like even when you kind of, I haven't seen it, I think you did, but just like even the stuff about Ted Bundy, it's like this like character deconstruction of like, how can this person who has done these like very heinous sort of crimes be this way, and kind of their place in sort of like this like mirror on humanity, if you will. But this way, even when they kind of do like Jack the Ripper documentaries, for instance, well, they'll just kind of be like, who was he? Maybe it was a woman, maybe it was this, and maybe this. There's just sort of this like this every again, like every minute is spent towards a central goal. And I think this was, although I do think like the ending was great, I just think the journey into finding that out, something I think could be tighter. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, do I think the ending was great because I, you know, sort of quote unquote slogged through the first like 2 episodes, or like, you know, 2.5 episodes, or is the story just great finding out what it was kind of thing? It's sort of like a coin toss kind of thing for me. But as I said, soft recommendations, because I do think there's a lot of great stuff in here. I just think that like something about it could be a little bit more streamlined. I just can't quite put my finger on exactly what it would be.
I will say though, one other thing, sorry, because I did really like this, that I do think differentiates it, is that he is actually involved in the true crime that we are following. And I think like maybe to your point, it could be 2 parts, or maybe it should have just been like a standard documentary. Like it didn't need to be kind of broken up in the way that it was. But I do think for me, that will remain kind of the most interesting part about it, is that he's not someone that just kind of got intrigued by this and then started studying the case and like pieced it together, which is what you do see with a lot of true crime documentaries right now. He actually was like overhearing a crime as it was kind of happening. And, you know, anyways, again, don't want to like reveal anything, but I think that to me is sort of the part that will make it just stand out from the rest right now, is just like his personal involvement.
Very true. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, fellow feathers in arms, that is episode number 3. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of one of our many tiers that start as low as $1. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. Nicole, when I say the phrase, "Are you afraid of the dark?" what is the first thing that comes to mind?
I don't know, like stuff from my childhood.
Close. That is where we will be going next week, listeners. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, listeners. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. She's Nicole Matthews, and you can follow her at...
You can follow me on Twitter at Nicole Matthews, and on Instagram at Marie Coley.
And I am Brandan Jones. You can follow me at Lamar Diablo on Twitter. And these are the rabbit holes that quack. Good night.